Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Out of the hundreds of tube and railway stations peppered throughout London, it's extremely rare for any two to share an identical name. By which I mean certain instances in which London Underground station and the National Railway station each have carbon copy titles, despite being some distance away from one another and forming no direct interchange. This is completely understandable, of course, as any such clash of names has the potential to cause confusion, and the only examples I can think of off the top of my head are the pair of stations serving Elephant and Castle, the stations at Bethnal Green, one of which is now served by the Overground, and arguably West Hampstead. Although if you can think of any other instances of this phenomenon, then please do be sure to let me know in the comments. For just under 25 years, between the 1920s and 1940s, a clear example of twin stations could be found just outside London, where, in the Hertfordshire village of Croxley Green, located between Watford and Rickmansworth, there were two Croxley Green stations. One served, initially, by the London and North Western Railway, and the other by the Metropolitan Railway. Between them, the two Croxley Green stations have an interesting story to tell, involving militant suffragettes, a forgotten railway dump, and even an Elton John connection. And in this video, I'd like to share their history with you. The first Croxley Green station, which is now an inaccessible tangle of weeds and undergrowth, having been disused for many years, had its roots in the former Watford and Rickmansworth Railway, which first began running in the autumn of 1862. This railway had been instigated by Robert Grosvenor, the first Baron of Ebury, who lived in Moor Park. His grand mansion is now the clubhouse for Moor Park Golf Club, and as its name suggests, the line connected the towns of Watford and Rickmansworth, with just one intermediate station at Watford High Street. As such, it was pretty short, stretching 4.5 miles between Watford Junction and a terminal at Church Street in Rickmansworth, the site of which is now covered by several builders' merchants and a hotel. Initially, Lord Ebury had ambitions of taking the line further to Vine Street Station in Oxbridge, but when this extension failed to materialise, the Watford and Rickmansworth Railway geared itself more towards serving local industry, and as such it had short branches connected to Benskin's Brewery in Watford, the offices of which now form the Museum of Watford, and Dickinson's Paper Mill, which once stood beside the Grand Union Canal. The track linked to the mill used to run across Croxley Moor. Watercress, which was grown in abundance in the Chase Valley, was also conveyed along the line in special hampers. Despite having these seemingly lucrative freight connections, the line struggled financially, and so in 1881, the London and North Western Railway, who had been sharing the running of the line, stepped in to take full control. Meanwhile, in London, the world's first underground line, the Metropolitan Railway, was beginning to edge its way into the suburbs. By 1881, it had reached Harrow, followed by Rickmansworth in 1887. At one point on Croxley Moor, the Metropolitan Railway even crossed the Watford to Rickmansworth line via this bridge. Seeing this competitor muscle in, along with the lucrative customer base such expansion brought, the London and North Western Railway decided it was time to get in on the action too. And so in 1908, they began work on a branch line, which, at a point just south of Watford High Street Station, forked off towards a new station at Watford West, crossed the Grand Union Canal at this bridge, and then terminated here, as the first Croxley Green station. The The London and North Western Railway's Croxley Green terminal opened on what's now Watford Road on the 15th of June 1912. And the following year, a new viaduct built over the River Colne between Watford and Bushey opened up access to central London, thus enabling trains to run between Croxley Green and Euston. At certain times, Croxley Green also offered services to Broad Street, a now lost terminal which stood in the heart of the city, right beside Liverpool Street Station, between 1865 and 1986. It's been speculated by some that the London and North Western built a line to Croxley Green purely to spite the Metropolitan Railway, which is believable given the ferocious animosity which existed between certain railway companies at the time, although they clearly realised their new branch had potential as they promoted it with the slogan, "Live in the country," similar to the famous Metroland branding which the Metropolitan Railway would adopt just a few years later. In the early hours of the 10th of March 1913, the first Croxley Green station experienced what was by far the most startling event in its history, when the station's buildings were gutted in an arson attack, the result of which caused £1,000 worth of damage, about $92,000 in today's money. Although the culprit, or culprits, were never apprehended, it's widely believed that those responsible were a gang of suffragettes. The evidence being that, shortly before the fire, a group of women had asked Police Constable Hagger the way to the station, and that same morning, Saunderton Station, just outside High Wycombe, had also been set fire to. And in that instance, placards were found nearby bearing the legends, "Votes for Women" and "Burning Tickets to Vote." From its opening and up until the mid-1960s, Croxley Green Station was equipped with a goods yard, the tracks of which were located here, on the site now covered by a residential street called Mayfair. The London and North Western Railway also maintained a dump beside Croxley Green Station, which they used to ditch waste collected from their London stations. By the early 1920s, this tip was causing quite a problem. In September 1923, it was reported that, due to internal heat, the large pile of rubbish had been smouldering away for an entire year, and as such, the smell, much of which emanated from rotten veg, had become objectionable, which is probably putting it mildly, to be honest. The problem was finally dealt with by the Watford Fire Brigade, who pumped large amounts of water into the mound of rubbish. As for trains, services to Croxley Green were hauled by steam locomotives during the station's first decade, and by 1922 the line had been electrified, allowing the Swiss-built Oerlikon stock to serve the line. In the 1930s, smaller tube-style trains, the joint stock, which was so called as they were jointly owned by both London Underground and the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, who'd come to run the Croxley Green branch in 1923, also worked on the line. In later years, other classes of train which operated on the line included the British Rail 501, 104 and 313 units. For many years, it was also possible to spot the distinctive red-coloured 1938 tube stock trundling along the Watford end of the Croxley branch, due to the fact that the line's maintenance depot at Wiganhall Road was used to stable cars used on the Bakerloo line, which until 1982 ran as far as Watford Junction. Although the London and North Western Railway had established themselves in Croxley Green, this didn't stop the Metropolitan Railway from setting their sights on the village too, and in the early 1920s they were granted permission to build their own branch line through the area, the route of which remains the same today, leaving the main line to Rickmansworth, just north of Moor Park, and then running through Croxley itself and over a high canal bridge, before terminating at Watford's Metropolitan line station on Casbury Park Avenue. Originally, and quite understandably, the Metropolitan Railway wanted this new branch to terminate in the heart of Watford, right on the High Street in fact, and as such, number 44 on the High Street was earmarked and purchased as the planned station building. This plan was scuppered however when various objections were raised to having the tracks run through Casbury Park, and to this day, Watford Met remains marooned from the town centre, whilst the building envisioned as its grand terminal now serves as the Wetherspoons Moon Underwater pub. If TV and film locations are your thing, by the way, you can spot Watford's Metropolitan line station in the 1982 drama Harry's Game. It appears in the opening of the first episode, when IRA hitman Billy Downs, played by Derek Thompson, makes his escape via the station, following the murder of a cabinet minister in central London. Interestingly, there are plans to build a third station on the Met Line's Watford branch too, this being a small halt between Watford and Croxley, which would have been sited pretty much opposite to the older Croxley Green station, and its main purpose would have been to provide access to West Herts Golf Club. Like the High Street station, of course, this stop never came to fruition, although just north of the intended site, on Gade Bank alongside the Grand Union Canal, the Metropolitan Railway did construct this row of houses to accommodate their workers. Whilst this may sound like a nice gesture, it would appear the cottages were built by the company as they considered the existing housing in the area to be too good for their staff. As one official was quoted as saying, the homes to be found in Croxley were of a much better class than our men required. Charming. As for the station buildings themselves, these were designed by the Metropolitan Railway's architect, Charles Walter Clark, who gave them a residential look in order to help them blend in with the surrounding areas. Although just over 2 miles long, construction of the branch to Croxley Green in Watford proved a rather tough task, as much of the line had to be forged through a deep cutting, with a number of high bridges also being required. When the Watford branch line opened in 1925, the Metropolitan's Croxley station was named Croxley Green, the exact same title as the older station, located less than a mile away on the same road. It maintained this identical name for 24 years, before switching to plain old Croxley in 1949, so as to avoid confusion. Although it certainly took them long enough to realise the potential problem, didn't it? Services were hauled by the Metropolitan Railway's electric locomotives from the outset, although for a brief period in the station's earliest days, steam engines ran through here too, taking services to Marylebone. In a manner similar to the older Watford and Rickmansworth Railway, the Metropolitan's branch was also utilised to serve local industry. In this case, the Rickmansworth Sand and Gravel Company, who operated a set of pits in Croxley Hall Woods. The 1920s were a lucrative time for this company, as the stone and gravel from their pits was needed to supply a boom in London house building. They also provided material for the construction of the first Wembley Stadium, and as such, a spur line was built from the Metropolitan line into the industrial site, which enabled wagons to cart their wares towards the capital. After the pits fell into decline, London Underground, in a manner similar to the dump beside the older Croxley Green station, turned the sites into their own personal tip, which saw rubbish brought in by train until at least the 1970s. So much waste was dumped here, in fact, that the ground level alongside the adjoining canal was raised significantly. If you take a stroll around the site of the old dump today, it's still possible to spot vintage tube-related bits and pieces lying about. These porcelain third rail insulators being a prime example. Broken bits of them are scattered absolutely everywhere. In centuries to come, I'm sure this area will make for a prime archaeological dig. Just north of the old spur line into the pits is another curiosity, the so-called North Curve, a track which enables trains to run directly between Watford and Amersham, as opposed to changing at Moor Park. Part of this curve runs through a short tunnel beneath Croxley Hall Wood, which, at just 80 metres long, happens to be the shortest tunnel on the entire underground network. Give or take the odd train first thing in the morning or last thing at night though, the North Curve isn't used in regular passenger service, which I think's a bit of a wasted opportunity, to be honest. What do you think? Once the Metropolitan Railway's Croxley Green station opened in 1925, the London, Scottish and Midland Railway, who were now in charge of the first Croxley Green station, began to feel the pinch of competition, and as such, at around the same time, they ran a campaign promoting their own links with Euston and Broad Street. Croxley's commuters, however, quickly began to favour the more modern Metropolitan line, which, as well as offering a more regular service, and also granting access to Euston via Euston Square, also went further by terminating at Aldgate. Passenger numbers at the old Croxley Green station soon began to dwindle, and in 1952, the Watford to the Rickmansworth railway, from which it had grown, was closed for good. Today, that disused route forms the Ebury Way cycle path. The branch between Croxley Green and Watford soldiered on though, and even managed to avoid closure in the 1960s, despite being singled out in the Beeching report. For a brief spell in the early 1980s, it seemed the line's fortunes were looking up, when in December 1982, a brand new station on the branch line was established on Vicarage Road, opened by Elton John no less, the purpose of which was to serve Watford FC on match days, and as such, some people came to nickname the station Hooligan Halt. By the late 1980s though, Croxley Green station itself had become very dilapidated, with the rots being so bad that the station buildings ended up being demolished, along with the original wooden platform, which was replaced with cheaper, temporary scaffolding. With the terminus now open to the elements and barely any information on display, passenger numbers continued to plummet, and by 1993, Croxley Green was reduced to a solitary service at 6 AM each morning, a so-called parliamentary train, designed to keep a skeleton timetable in place, as opposed to beginning the more expensive process of permanent closure. In March 1996, some 84 years after the line had first opened, train services ceased for good when the track into Croxley Green was severed by the construction of a new dual carriageway at Ascot Road. Amazingly, the station still limped on in a zombie-like manner, technically kept open by a replacement bus service, although this ended in 2003, leading to the final official closure of the station. Today, the old line and its former stations at Croxley Green, Watford West and Vicarage Road languish in an utterly dilapidated state, overgrown and almost unrecognisable. Since the 80s, there have been hopes that the once two competing lines would come together in a venture that's come to be dubbed the Croxley Rail link, the idea being that such a connection would enable the Metropolitan line to run all the way to Watford Junction. Indeed, in recent years, the project was given the go-ahead, and some prep work was carried out, only for this scheme to be cancelled in 2018. Nevertheless, a fair number of alternative ideas have been mooted in the wake of this cancellation, including suggestions for a tunnel beneath Canterbury Park, a cheaper shuttle service which would nip to and from Watford Junction and Ascot Road, and in a very futuristic sounding proposal, the idea of running a fleet of pod-like vehicles along the route. I'll leave a link to a report outlining these proposals in the comments, as I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. Although of course whether or not any of them ever see the light of day remains to be seen. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of the two Croxley Green stations. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you have them, memories of these two stations. And what about the Croxley Rail link? Do you think it'll ever happen? Please be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.